He had nothing, no family, no home, not even a proper coat against the mountain cold. But when Gideon Nash found the bleeding girl collapsed in the snow, he made a choice that would bring 30 armed warriors to his doorstep within hours. What he thought was simple kindness was about to ignite something far more dangerous than he ever imagined. The wind cut through the thin fabric of Gideon's worn shirt as he climbed the rocky slope, his stomach cramping from hunger. 3 days without a proper meal, and winter was closing in fast around the mountain peaks. At 16, he'd learned to survive on scraps and determination, but the approaching storm threatened to test even his hardened resilience. A splash of crimson against white snow made him freeze. Blood, fresh blood. Following the dark trail, Gideon discovered her. A young native girl, maybe his age, unconscious and bleeding from a deep gash on her leg. Her buckskin dress was torn, and frost had already begun forming on her black hair. She wouldn't last another hour in this cold. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away. Getting involved with tribal matters meant trouble, the kind that got settlers killed or worse. But as he stared at her pale face, something deeper than survival kicked in. "Can't just leave you here," he muttered, kneeling beside her. She stirred as he touched her shoulder, dark eyes snapping open with sudden fear. Her hand shot to a bone knife at her belt, but weakness made her movements clumsy. "Easy," Gideon said, raising his hands. "I want to help." She spoke rapidly in her native tongue, pointing toward the eastern peaks. Even through the language barrier, he understood. She needed to get home, and fast. The girl tried to stand but collapsed immediately, crying out as her injured leg buckled. Gideon caught her before she hit the ground, feeling how cold her skin had become. Hypothermia was setting in. "Those peaks?" he asked, pointing east. "That's 2 days through Dead Man's Pass." She nodded desperately, tears freezing on her cheeks. Gideon looked at his meager supplies, barely enough food for himself, no medical supplies, and winter gear that was more holes than fabric. Taking her through the mountains would likely kill them both, but leaving her here would definitely kill her. "All right," he said quietly. "We go together or not at all." For the next 18 hours, Gideon half carried, half dragged the girl through terrain that would challenge experienced mountain men. She drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling words he couldn't understand but felt in his bones. Desperate prayers, maybe, or warnings. When they finally reached the edge of her tribal lands, she managed to stand on her own. She pressed something into his palm, a small carved stone, before disappearing into the forest without looking back. Gideon stumbled back to his mountain cave as dawn broke, exhausted but alive. He'd done the right thing, even if it nearly killed him. But as he approached his shelter, something made his blood run cold. Dozens of hoofprints surrounded his cave, fresh prints, and carved into the tree beside his entrance was a symbol he'd never seen before. 3 parallel lines crossed by an arrow. Someone had been here, someone who knew exactly where to find him. Gideon circled his cave 3 times before entering, his hand never leaving the rusty knife at his belt. The hoofprints told a story he didn't want to read. At least 15 horses, maybe more, all shod in the distinctive style he'd seen on tribal ponies. They'd waited here for hours, studying his meager belongings, learning his patterns. Inside the cave, everything looked exactly as he'd left it. But something felt wrong. His sleeping blanket had been moved, just slightly, but enough for someone who knew every thread of his few possessions. His small cooking pot sat at a different angle. Even his collection of smooth river stones had been disturbed. They were looking for something, he whispered to the empty cave. But what could he possibly have that warriors would want? He owned nothing of value. No gold, no weapons worth stealing, no information about settler movements. Unless his fingers found the carved stone the girl had pressed into his palm. In daylight, he could see it clearly. Polished black rock with intricate symbols carved deep into its surface. It felt warm against his skin, almost alive. A branch snapped outside. Gideon froze, every muscle tensing. That wasn't wind. Something heavy had stepped on dead wood, something trying to move quietly, but failing. Peering through a crack in the rocks, his heart nearly stopped. 3 warriors sat motionless on their horses 30 yards away, watching his cave. War paint streaked their faces, and eagle feathers adorned their black hair. Their eyes never moved from his hiding place. They knew he was inside. How long had they been waiting? How had they found him so quickly? The girl couldn't have told them. She'd barely been conscious when they separated. One warrior raised his hand, and somewhere behind Gideon's cave, Horses whinnied softly. More riders. He was surrounded. The lead warrior dismounted slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on a tomahawk that looked like it had tasted blood recently. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the thin mountain air. "Boy who helped our daughter, we know you are there." Gideon's throat went dry. Daughter? The girl was someone important, not just any tribal member, but family to whoever these men were. "Come out. We wish to speak." Every fiber of Gideon's being screamed danger. In every story he'd heard, white men who got involved with tribal affairs ended up scalped or worse. But he was trapped like a rabbit in a den, with nowhere to run and winter closing in. The warrior continued, his voice carrying an edge that made Gideon's skin crawl. "You have something that belongs to us." The carved stone seemed to burn against his palm. Whatever this object was, it was important enough to bring armed men into the mountains. Important enough to track him down within hours. Gideon closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decision. Step outside and face whatever these warriors wanted, or stay hidden and eventually die of thirst and cold when winter trapped him in the cave. When he opened his eyes, the lead warrior was walking directly toward his cave entrance, and his expression suggested patience was no longer an option. Gideon stepped from the cave with his hands raised, the carved stone hidden in his closed fist. 30 warriors materialized from behind rocks and trees like shadows gaining substance. More men than he'd imagined. All armed, all watching him with expressions he couldn't read. The lead warrior stopped 5 feet away, close enough that Gideon could see the intricate scars marking his weathered face. This was no ordinary hunting party. These were seasoned fighters, and their presence here meant something far more serious than a simple rescue. "I am Dakota," the warrior said in carefully measured English. "Ayanna is my daughter." Gideon's mouth went dry. A chief's daughter. He'd saved a chief's daughter without knowing it, and now her father stood before him with enough men to level a small town. "She told me what you did," Dakota continued, his dark eyes never leaving Gideon's face. "How you carried her through the killing cold when you could have walked away." The other warriors remained silent, but Gideon could feel their tension like electricity before a storm. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture, and this conversation would end very differently. Anyone would have done the same, Gideon managed, though his voice cracked on the words. Dakota's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "No, most would not. Most fear us too much to risk helping." He gestured to his men. "We have been hunting the men who attacked our camp. 3 settlers, armed with rifles, who shot my daughter when she tried to warn them away from our sacred grounds." Gideon felt ice form in his stomach. Settlers, white men like him, men who might assume he was working with them. "We tracked them to your mountain," Dakota said, his voice growing harder. "Their trail led directly past your cave. We thought perhaps—" He left the sentence hanging, but the implication struck Gideon like a physical blow. They'd suspected him of being involved in the attack. "But Ayanna described the boy who saved her," Dakota continued. "Thin, hungry, with kind eyes and gentle hands. Not the description of a man who shoots women." Relief flooded through Gideon, but it was short-lived. If these warriors were hunting armed settlers in his territory, blood would be spilled soon. And when territorial authorities came looking for answers, they'd find him, the only white face in the area. "The men you're hunting," Gideon said carefully. "They're still up here." Dakota nodded grimly. "Close, very close. They made camp in the valley below, thinking they are safe." His hand moved to his tomahawk. "They are wrong." One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. Dakota's expression darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Gideon asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "My scout says smoke rises from their camp. They are cooking fresh meat." Dakota's voice turned deadly quiet. "Meat they stole from families they murdered yesterday." The weight of the situation crashed down on Gideon. He was trapped between a war party seeking vengeance and desperate criminals with nothing left to lose. The mountains that had been his sanctuary were about to become a killing ground. Dakota stepped closer, his presence commanding and dangerous. "You saved my daughter's life. For this, I offer you choice." Gideon waited, hardly breathing. "Leave these mountains now before the sun sets. Ride far and fast, and never return." Dakota's eyes bore into him. "Or stay, and help us end the men who spill innocent blood on sacred ground." The carved stone felt heavy in Gideon's palm as he realized the impossible position he was in. Run and spend his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if he'd made the right choice, or stay and become part of something that could destroy everything he'd built. But as Dakota waited for his answer, gunshots echoed from the valley below. The gunshots echoed off the mountain walls like thunder, followed by screams that chilled Gideon's blood. Not war cries, screams of terror and pain. Dakota's warriors instantly transformed from waiting statues into fluid motion, mounting their horses with practiced efficiency. But Dakota himself remained motionless, his eyes locked on Gideon. "Choose now, boy. The killing has already begun." Another volley of shots cracked through the air. Closer this time. Someone was running up the mountain, firing wildly as they climbed. Through the trees, Gideon glimpsed 3 figures scrambling up the rocky slope. The settlers, fleeing toward his cave with desperate panic. "They're coming here," Gideon breathed, realizing the horrible truth. The criminals knew about his cave. They were leading the fight directly to his doorstep. Dakota's expression turned deadly. "You know these men?" "No," Gideon said quickly. "But they've been watching my camp. They know where I live." The lead warrior's hand tightened on his weapon. In seconds, armed murderers would reach the cave, followed by 30 tribal warriors seeking blood. Gideon would be caught in the middle of a massacre with nowhere to run. "Get behind the rocks," Dakota commanded his men. "Let them come." But Gideon saw something that made his stomach drop. One of the fleeing settlers carried a rifle he recognized, a distinctive brass-fitted weapon he'd seen in town. It belonged to Marshal Crawford, the territorial lawman who'd been missing for 2 weeks. These weren't just thieves or claim jumpers. They'd killed a federal marshal. "Wait," Gideon called out as the first settler crashed through the tree line 50 yards below. "If you kill them here, the army will come. They'll blame your people for the marshal's death." Dakota paused, understanding the implications immediately. Dead settlers at a native ambush site would bring cavalry troops and retribution against his entire tribe. The 3 criminals were close enough now that Gideon could see their faces. Desperate, wild-eyed men with blood on their clothes and death in their wake. The leader spotted the cave and pointed, shouting something to his companions. They were going to use his shelter as a fort. "You cannot let them reach the cave," Dakota said grimly. "If they take position there, we must dig them out. Many will die." Gideon's mind raced. The settlers were 30 seconds from his cave. The warriors needed a clear shot but couldn't risk being blamed for a massacre. And he was the only one who could stop it from becoming a bloodbath that would destroy innocent lives. The carved stone seemed to pulse in his palm, and suddenly he understood why Ayanna had given it to him. It wasn't just a token of gratitude. It was a symbol of trust, of responsibility. He stepped into the open, directly into the path of the climbing criminals. "That's far enough," he shouted, raising his hands. The lead settler raised his rifle, finger on the trigger, his eyes wild with desperation and fear. "Get out of the way, boy, or I'll put you down." Behind the rocks, 30 warriors drew their weapons silently, waiting for Dakota's signal. One wrong word from Gideon, and the mountain would explode in violence. But instead of stepping aside, Gideon did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Gideon sat down, right there in the middle of the confrontation, with rifles pointed at his chest and 30 warriors ready to strike. He calmly lowered himself to the ground and crossed his legs like he had all the time in the world. "What the hell are you doing?" the lead criminal snarled, his rifle wavering between Gideon and the rocks where he could sense hidden danger. "Waiting for you to make a choice," Gideon said quietly. "See, you can shoot me, but the moment you pull that trigger, you'll have bigger problems than whatever's chasing you up that mountain." The criminal's eyes darted around nervously. His 2 companions reached the rocky outcrop, gasping and bleeding from cuts sustained during their panicked climb. They'd lost their horses, most of their ammunition, and clearly hadn't eaten in days. "We just need to use your cave for a few hours," the leader said, trying to sound reasonable. "Then we'll be gone." "That cave belongs to the tribe whose land you're standing on," Gideon replied, pulling out the carved stone. "And they don't take kindly to trespassers." The moment the criminals saw the tribal artifact, their faces went white. They'd spent enough time in the territory to know what it meant. "You're working with them?" the second man gasped. "I'm trying to keep you alive," Gideon said, "which is more than you deserve after what you did to Marshal Crawford." The leader's rifle snapped back to Gideon. "How do you know about that?" "Because you're carrying his weapon, and his blood is still on your clothes." Gideon's voice stayed steady despite his racing heart. "Question is, how many other innocent people did you kill on your way up here?" Behind the rocks, Dakota's warriors remained hidden but ready. Gideon could feel their presence like coiled springs, waiting for the signal to strike. But he also knew that once the violence started, it wouldn't stop until everyone was dead. "Here's what's going to happen," Gideon continued. "You're going to put down your weapons and surrender to tribal justice. Or you're going to keep running and hope you make it to the territorial border before winter kills you." "Like hell," the leader spat. "We're taking that cave." But as he stepped forward, an arrow buried itself in the ground 6 inches from his boot. Then another, then a third, each one closer than the last. The criminals spun around wildly, trying to spot the archers but saw only empty rocks and shifting shadows. Panic began to overtake desperation in their eyes. 30 warriors, Gideon said conversationally. "All around you, all with orders to take you alive if possible." He paused. "But they're not feeling particularly merciful after what you did to their families." The truth hit the criminals like a physical blow. They weren't being chased by a small hunting party. They'd stumbled into the territory of an entire war band seeking vengeance. "You led us into a trap," the leader accused, his voice cracking. "You led yourselves," Gideon replied, "the moment you chose to spill innocent blood on sacred ground." Another arrow whispered past the second criminal's ear, and his nerve broke completely. He dropped his rifle and raised his hands, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. "I surrender. I surrender." But the leader wasn't finished. With nothing left to lose and madness gleaming in his eyes, he swung his rifle toward Gideon. "If I'm dying today, you're coming with me." The shot echoed across the mountains, but Gideon never felt the bullet. A tomahawk had already found its mark, and the criminal leader crumpled to the ground before his finger could fully squeeze the trigger. Dakota emerged from behind the rocks, his remaining warriors flowing around the 2 surviving criminals like water around stones. In seconds, the threat was over, but as Gideon stood up, brushing dirt from his clothes, he realized something that chilled him more than the mountain wind. The gunshot would bring cavalry troops within days, and when they arrived, they'd find dead settlers in tribal territory, with Gideon as the only witness to what really happened. Dakota bound the 2 surviving criminals with rawhide strips, while his warriors searched the bodies. What they found confirmed Gideon's worst fears: military dispatches, territorial maps, and a cavalry officer's insignia hidden in the dead leader's pack. "These men killed more than settlers," Dakota said grimly, holding up the officer's bars. "They attacked a military patrol." Gideon's stomach dropped. Killing a marshal was serious enough, but attacking cavalry troops meant the army would send a full company to investigate. They'd follow the trail of destruction directly to this mountain, and when they found bodies in tribal territory, they wouldn't ask questions. "How long before soldiers come?" Dakota asked. 3 days. "Maybe 4, Gideon replied, trying to calculate distances and army response times. "But when they get here, they'll see dead whites and live natives. Won't matter what really happened." The chief's weathered face showed no emotion, but Gideon could see the weight of responsibility in his dark eyes. One wrong decision could bring war to his people, women and children who had nothing to do with this violence. "My warriors want to scalp these men and leave their bodies for the soldiers to find," Dakota said quietly. "Show them what happens to those who attack our families. That'll start a war that'll kill more innocents than these 3 ever could," Gideon said urgently. One of the bound criminals, a young man barely older than Gideon, began sobbing uncontrollably. "Please don't scalp me. Please, I never killed nobody. I just ran when the shooting started." Dakota studied the crying man with cold calculation. "You ran with murderers. You took their blood money. You are guilty." But something in the young criminal's terror sparked an idea in Gideon's mind. A desperate plan that might save everyone, if he could convince Dakota to trust him completely. "What if the soldiers never found bodies at all?" Gideon said slowly. Dakota's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "These men were running from something bigger than your war party. They mentioned gold, claim jumps, territorial disputes. What if they just disappeared? Got lost in the mountains during winter, never to be seen again?" The surviving criminals' eyes widened in horror as they realized what Gideon was suggesting. "The army would still come looking," Dakota pointed out. "But they'd find my testimony instead of bodies," Gideon said. "I'd tell them the truth. Criminals came through, got caught in an early blizzard, probably died somewhere in the deep ravines. Happens every winter." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that could determine his people's survival. His warriors watched him intently, ready to follow whatever decision he made. "And these two?" he asked, nodding toward the bound men. "They come with us. Your people need witnesses who can confirm that the tribe acted in self-defense, not aggression. When the time comes, they'll tell the truth about who started the killing." The young criminal nodded frantically. "Yes, I'll tell them everything. How Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping. How my partner shot him when he wouldn't take our bribe. I'll swear to it." But Dakota's expression remained skeptical. White man's word means nothing when spoken against white soldiers. "Maybe," Gideon admitted, "but it's better than starting a war over dead criminals." A warrior approached Dakota and spoke rapidly in their native tongue, pointing toward the valley. The chief's face darkened as he listened. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "Scout reports army dust on the eastern trail. They are already coming." Gideon felt ice form in his veins. "How many?" 20 soldiers, moving fast. They had hours, not days. Whatever plan they chose had to happen now, before the cavalry arrived and found evidence of the confrontation. Dakota looked from the bodies to his warriors to Gideon, the weight of his people's future pressing down on him like the approaching winter storm. Dakota made his decision with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his life balancing war and survival. "We move the bodies to the deep canyon," he commanded his warriors. "Make it look like they fell during a storm." As the warriors lifted the dead criminal, Gideon noticed something that made his blood run cold. The man's rifle had discharged when he fell, and the bullet had struck the rocky wall of Gideon's cave, leaving a fresh scar in the stone. "The cavalry will see that," Gideon said, pointing to the bullet mark. "They'll know there was a fight here." Dakota examined the damaged stone, his jaw tightening. "Then we make them see something else." The chief barked orders in his native tongue, and his warriors immediately began transforming the scene. They scattered cooking gear around the cave entrance, built a small fire pit, and even spread Gideon's few belongings to make it look like a long-term camp. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked. "Creating a story the soldiers will believe," Dakota replied, pulling out a piece of charcoal. "You have been living here peacefully. The criminals came, demanded supplies, fired warning shots when you refused." With swift strokes, Dakota darkened the bullet scar until it looked like old fire damage rather than fresh lead. Other warriors scattered brass cartridge cases from an old hunting trip, making it appear that multiple people had been shooting over several days. "You fought them off," Dakota continued, "but they fled into the storm. You never saw them again." It was a good story, but Gideon spotted a fatal flaw. "What about their horses? The cavalry will track them here." Dakota smiled grimly. "Their horses died in the canyon with them. Tragic accident." The efficiency was breathtaking. In less than an hour, 30 warriors had completely altered the crime scene, moved 3 bodies to a remote ravine, and created a convincing narrative that would satisfy military investigators. But as they finished, one of the bound criminals began panicking. "You can't just leave us with him," the older man pleaded, staring at Gideon with desperate eyes. "What happens when the soldiers leave? What happens to us then?" Dakota's expression was unreadable. "That depends on whether you keep your word about telling the truth." The sound of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. The cavalry was closer than expected, their pace indicating urgency rather than routine patrol. "Take positions," Dakota ordered his warriors, "but stay hidden until I signal." As his men melted into the landscape, Dakota placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. The gesture was more than tactical. It was acceptance, trust, recognition. "You saved my daughter's life," the chief said quietly. "Today you may save my people's future. This makes you brother to our tribe, if you choose to accept it." Before Gideon could respond, the carved stone in his palm grew warm. He looked down and saw that its symbols had changed in the light, revealing deeper meanings he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just a token of gratitude, it was a mark of adoption, of belonging. "I accept," Gideon whispered. Dakota nodded once, then vanished into the rocks as if he'd never been there. 20 cavalry soldiers crested the ridge, their blue uniforms stark against the winter landscape. At their head rode a captain with the weathered look of a career frontier officer, his eyes already scanning for signs of the violence that had brought them here. Gideon stood alone beside his cave, 2 bound criminals at his feet, preparing to tell a story that would either save an entire tribe or condemn them all. The captain reined in his horse 10 feet away, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Son, I'm Captain Morrison, Territorial Cavalry. We're tracking 3 men who killed a federal marshal and attacked a military convoy. Have you seen them? Gideon met Captain Morrison's gaze steadily, the carved stone warm in his palm. I saw them, Captain. 3 men, desperate and dangerous. They came through here 2 days ago, demanding supplies and shelter. The captain dismounted, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the camp. And I refuse to help criminals, Gideon said simply. Told them to move on. That's when the shooting started. He pointed to the darkened scar on the cave wall. Warning shots, trying to scare me into cooperation. When that didn't work, they took what little food I had and headed into the high country. Captain Morrison examined the bullet mark, the scattered brass casings, the signs of struggle. Everything supported Gideon's story. These the men who were with them? The captain asked, nodding toward the bound criminals. No, sir. These 2 showed up yesterday, half frozen and starving. Said they'd been traveling with the gang but got separated during a snowstorm in the deep canyon. The older prisoner nodded frantically. That's right. Crawford tried to arrest us for claim jumping, but when he wouldn't take our partner's bribe, they shot him. Me and Billy here, we just ran when the killing started. The younger criminal, Billy, was crying again. We never wanted anybody to die. Captain, when the shooting started in that canyon, we just kept running. Haven't seen our partners since. Captain Morrison studied their faces carefully. Frontier soldiers learned to read desperation and truth in equal measure. You're saying your partners are still out there? If they're still alive, Billy whispered. That canyon's a death trap in winter. Nobody could survive up there without proper gear. The captain walked to the edge of the rocky outcrop and stared into the vast wilderness beyond. Miles of treacherous terrain, hidden ravines, and early winter storms that could bury men without a trace. We'll search the area, Morrison decided. But if they went into the deep country during that storm, he shrugged. Nature's got its own justice out here. Gideon felt relief flood through him, but kept his expression neutral. What about these 2? They'll stand trial for their part in Crawford's death, but their cooperation will be noted. The captain mounted his horse. Son, you did the right thing refusing to help those killers. Took courage. As the cavalry prepared to leave with their prisoners, Captain Morrison paused. You planning to winter up here alone? Gideon looked toward the hidden rocks where he knew Dakota's warriors waited. Actually, Captain, I've been offered a place with some local friends. Good people who know these mountains better than anyone. Smart choice. These peaks aren't forgiving to men without allies. After the soldiers disappeared down the mountain trail, Dakota emerged from concealment, his warriors flowing out of the landscape like morning mist. The chief's weathered face showed something Gideon had never seen before. Genuine gratitude mixed with deep respect. You spoke well, brother, Dakota said, using the tribal word that meant family by choice rather than blood. Your words have prevented much bloodshed. Gideon held out the carved stone, but Dakota shook his head. Keep it. You have earned the right. The chief placed a firm hand on Gideon's shoulder. Our winter camp has room for 1 more, if you choose to stay. Looking back at his empty cave, then at the warriors who had accepted him as family, Gideon's decision came easily. I choose to stay. That evening, as snow began falling on the high peaks, Gideon sat beside a warm fire in the tribal camp, learning his first words in their language, while Ayanna translated stories of courage and belonging. The homeless boy who had nothing was now a brother to an entire people, his act of simple kindness having transformed not just his own destiny, but prevented a war that could have destroyed countless innocent lives. The carved stone rested in his palm, no longer a mysterious artifact, but a symbol of the family he had gained by choosing compassion over safety, courage over comfort. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale, where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.